That's fine.
I'm
Great.
demonstrating my tech competence.
Wonderful. This is great. I really appreciate. Thank you for the kind words, Blaine. Far too kind. I want to thank you actually personally for all the work that you've been doing and your leadership and organization. And I want to thank the members of the executive committee. What a wonderful, probably honestly, the greatest group of people I've ever worked with, the most fun and insightful and interesting. And it's just been a pleasure. So thank you all for having me. Thanks for inviting me. I have a lot of ground I'm going to cover because what I'm going to do today in this little talk, the better angles of our nature, intentional, of course, I'm going to share with you in 45 minutes my life's work. So, and of course, this is entirely open to critique and criticism and feedback, right? So, but what I've tried to do is distill the essence of what I think, at least in my experience and in the work that I've done, are some of the key issues that help us understand and help frame the discussions of a moral science from a sociological perspective. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just jump right in. And I may talk a little bit fast at time, but like I said, I'm trying to cover 30 years of a career in 45 minutes. So here we go. Of course, I'm starting off here with a quote from Rolling Stones. If I had time, I'd play a little bit of the music, but I don't think we have time to get into all of that. But each discipline, I want to start by saying, offers unique and important contributions to the development of the moral science project, or a science of human morality. Philosophers and ethicists help us understand core assumptions and key arguments as to the ontological and the epistemological foundations of morality and virtue. The psychologists and the educational specialists study the cognitive mechanisms and the personality traits involved in moral development. And I will share some good news. I've been accepted into a Doctor of Ed program, so I've just started another doctorate in education. So hopefully I'll have something else to learn and share along the way. And sociology's potential contributions are several. The sociologists, for example, study, as I'm sure most of you already know, the socio-historical, the cultural context within which ethical systems are established. Central focus has been why certain values may ascend to prominence within societies and at certain times become institutionalized, and then, of course, hold sway over large groups of people. But in addition, sociologists, one of our sort of, I guess, our calling cards would be to investigate the interpersonal and the cultural factors that contribute to our understanding of why individuals and groups act or fail to act virtuously, or what that would mean in a literal sense would be in accordance with the prevailing moral and ethical standards. So in studying crime, for example, a core analytic question deals with the question of why some people violate legal standards. In other words, why do they break the law, right? And here the discipline most clearly overlaps, I think, with the psychological perspective, or anyone who's interested in studying the determinants of individual level behavior and human development. And then thirdly, sociologists study the social construction of morality, which includes the types of judgments rendered and social control that people exercise over each other. So we shift the analytic focus from why people violate norms to why individuals and groups judge people as behaving morally or immorally. So, and this requires that we examine the social locations of human actors in relation to those who evaluate their behavior, right? The relative statuses of the actors who are involved, and what I call the social forces that affect the evaluations of one another. So in other words, it's not simply a matter of what one, the fact that one might be speeding on a highway, right? I suspect some of us have maybe even gotten tickets for speeding somewhere along the way. My late father told me he'd been pulled over twice for speeding in his lifetime, but he never got a ticket. And I, on the other hand, have not been so fortunate. I have probably at least a dozen speeding tickets. So what's the main difference? Well, my dad was an FBI agent, and he merely showed his ID whenever he was pulled over. So no problems on that front. The obvious point is that the same behavior, it's illicit, it's illegal, right? Speeding is going to be evaluated differently depending upon the participants involved, their relationships to each other, and their relative statuses and the social context of the encounter. So that's how I frame this whole discussion, okay? And I'm going to offer today a preliminary theory as to why human beings evaluate others as behaving morally or virtuously if we hold constant the behavior in question, like speeding, for example, right? And that's the broader sociological point I want to make about morality. That is that morality always has the social location, without which we're at a loss to meaningfully understand the cultural significance of normative structures or why people view behaviors as relatively moral or immoral. So I hope that makes sense in terms of setting the context. I'm going to share four main ideas then. I'm arguing that morality does not exist, obviously, in the social vacuum. And so the fundamental claims I'm going to make today are that first, being defined as moral or virtuous constitutes a very highly regarded or desirable, even a revered type of status, and one that's unequally distributed across human populations. Not only are people differentially evaluated, but the standards of morality are applied unequally, and ever more so in more complex heterogeneous societies. So while we might believe in or endorse certain platitudes, such as everyone's equal before the law, these claims of universalism are actually inconsistent with our knowledge of status systems. The comparative evidence suggests there's not one standard of morality, but rather a status hierarchy in which there's an interpersonal and even, we might say, competitive process through which some acquire more status than others. In fact, I argue further that we maybe don't even want to really eliminate the status differences, because if we did, we'd have to eliminate all of the social information, all of the performative demonstrations like I'm doing right now, associated, for example, with courtroom trials or public presentations of any kind. In other words, we'd be left with just the raw, pure information. And even that, of course, is socially constructed, but that's a whole other issue, right? But we don't want to eliminate this stuff, and we don't want just the pristine facts because we actually seem to want the social and contextual information. And that helps us frame our understanding of the situation. So that's one claim. I also want to argue that morality always has a distinctive social location, or occurs within social relational context, by which Ridgway, recent president of the American Sociological Association, now professor emeritus at Stanford, means the interpersonal settings, but also other situations in which actors must take the expected reactions of others into account in deciding how to act themselves. And so, end quote. So these relational contexts always exist temporally and culturally in a social universe, such that the actual content that attaches to the different configurations can and does vary across ecological and environmental context. So for example, the existing material resources, the technologies, the spiritual beliefs, all of these things can and do vary widely across the social universe. But I'm going to be addressing, I won't be addressing why that's the case, and the ultimate origins, for example, of cultural content. That's a whole other, set of issues. Third, I want to argue that there are fields of interaction in which we're all engaged, including right now, that provide the contexts within which the various social forces operate and produce the differential evaluations and judgments, almost as predictably as actual forces of nature constrain the behavior of projectiles or planetary motion. Simply put, morality ultimately depends upon our relative positions within social relationships, or what I call, again, the better angles of our nature that describe our positions relative to those with whom we interact. And these socio-spatial configurations within which we find ourselves involve multiple dimensions that align us at different angles and thereby help shape the manner in which we are evaluated as relatively moral or immoral, virtuous or profligate. And finally, I'm going to share my thoughts today for the first time ever on what I believe to be the key social psychological mechanisms involved that help to explain, or I might say energize, the social forces that impel the observed behavioral responses and evaluations. So these ideas are perhaps my most tentative of all, but then pretty much everything I assert is tentative. That's also why I'm a rather boring interview when I do various media. I'm usually busy clarifying and qualifying my cautious remarks rather than offering bombastic and highly contentious claims. And that's what people really want to hear, right? Oh, well, that's not me. But let me start with a pretty obvious example to kick this off. So, who won the 2020 presidential election in the United States? Apparently, and again, I'm living in Canada these days, and I've been a Canadian since 1990. I grew up in the States, but apparently, I've learned that there's been some dispute about the presidential election. Apparently, not everybody agrees. But again, I'm a little bit out of the loop there. The sociological perspective, though, allows us to consider these social forces and look at the social locations that might inform the evaluations and how other people interpret the behaviors that have occurred and deem the various actors as virtuous or not, or moral or not, right? And so I can't think of a better example than this recent presidential election. So who won the election? Well, according to one summary analysis in mid-December, Biden won over 81 million votes, 51+%. President Trump won over 74 million votes, or almost 47%. And the remaining couple of percent went to other candidates. The absolute and final tallies, of course, may change slightly with further counting and analysis and so on, but these are pretty well accepted, the final tallies, within a few, thousands or tens of thousands of votes, the official vote count. And the US had a remarkable turnout of 2/3 of the eligible voters, which was the highest percentage, by the way, since the 1900 election. So again, it might seem obvious at one level as to who won. And in fact, according to the national poll by Reuters and Ipsos, 73% of those who were polled believed that Biden won the election, and 5% thought that Trump won the election. And then you had a number of undecideds. Just when asked very specifically a quote unquote factual question, who won? But if you're asked more in a nuanced fashion, whether or not Biden rightfully won the election, you get a vastly different result. In fact, more than half of the Republicans believe that Trump rightfully won the US election. But further, that it was stolen due to voter fraud favoring the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. Only 29% of Republicans believed or agreed that Biden had rightfully won. Okay. When asked why, Republicans were deeply concerned that state vote counters had tipped the result toward Biden. And in fact, more than 2/3 felt that of the Republicans, that is, were concerned that the election was rigged. And only 16%, 1 in 6 Democrats, and about 1/3 of independents were similarly worried. Okay, so again, this is a national poll, with certain confidence intervals, plus or minus 4%, et cetera, in terms of the accuracy. So the point, of course, is that even the so-called facts and the evidence in this case are subject to vastly different interpretations. And in fact, many people actually get entirely different information on top of that, right? As we all know, okay? So even though if you're looking at the same facts, how's it possible that people could generate vastly different conclusions, at least in some instances, right? If you're a Democrat, are nearly all of these Republicans delusional? Or if you're a Republican, are the majority of Democrats delusional? So we have a real problem here, don't we? But step outside the US, as I said, I'm in Canada. And when you ask Canadians and do national surveys of Canadians, including conservatives, right? So a full range of the Canadian population, you see overwhelmingly that they believe that Biden won. And furthermore, perhaps this is a bit of a confirmation bias, about 84% prefer that Biden would win. So even conservatives in Canada, the majority of whom, by the way, believed or wanted Biden to win the election. So that obviously points to political differences, right? But I argue it's not just a matter of politics, it's a matter of social location. We're north of the United States, and we're not just geographically, but we're also socially and culturally in a different position vis-a-vis the US presidential politics. We care, but we care as much about probably Meghan Markle and hairy leaving as we do about the election south of the border. So we do have other concerns. But my point, of course, is that ultimately, Trump built his career by the way, if you believe that Trump won, or sorry, that Biden won the election, and I tend to believe that to be the case. I haven't seen any evidence that would dissuade me of that view. But if you believe that, then are we smarter up here? That since we have, and even conservatives are more likely to argue that Biden won. No, but we're situated socially in a different position. And Trump built his career as being a real estate developer, and the key mantra in real estate, of course, is location, location, location. And in sociology, it's social location, social location, social location. All right, so that's my framing. Now, why is this relevant? Well, especially with respect to morality, the key question is what determines whether people are deemed moral or not. And to be considered moral or virtuous means that one has a special status. In other words, one's even admired or revered. Simply put, if we think of someone as morally upstanding, then we're effectively giving that person status. And we don't view everyone as equally deserving of status or as equally morally upstanding. Instead, the morality of my behavior and your behavior is always linked socially, or it's socially situated and evaluated accordingly. So if I hold off in advance of the enemy's infantry by gunning down their soldiers, I'm a hero, right? The fictional sniper, Private Daniel Jackson, kills several Germans in the bell tower in Saving Private Ryan before a tank destroys his perch. But if I'm Charles Whitman on August 1st, 1966, and I ascend to the observation deck atop the main building, the tower at the University of Texas, and I fire indiscriminately on people, and I kill 14 and injure 31 others, then I'm clearly the villain. I'm evil. The obvious point is that it's not the killing behavior that determines its morality. Thou shalt not kill. Well, the thing about those commandments is that they didn't add all the contextual information and all the exceptions and all the contingencies, right? Instead, the social context dictate and demand radically different behaviors that are evaluated quite differently. So the soldier, on the one hand, conforms to group expectations and behaves appropriately in the war context, while the serial killer clearly violates societal norms and unjustifiably commits mass murder. The former displays moral courage, the latter cowardice, and evil, some would say. But why is this the case? Because morality is not an abstract, it is obviously a philosophical concept, but it's played out in real time and in the real world and in face-to-face and in group interactions. And so we have to look at social context and relative social locations. So for example, the notion of acting with integrity refers to the quality of being honest, having strong moral principles. How does one become a paragon of virtue? In other words, a judge is having very few or small or no real moral faults. If I told you that I have a certain amount of money or credit cards, could you be persuaded of the truthfulness of that claim? Probably, right? Especially if I reveal my tax returns, okay? But yet if I told you that I also have a certain amount of power, such as the ability to walk on my hands, or that I have a black belt in karate, which I do, by the way. Whoop-de-doo. You can still kick my ass, by the way. Or I can bench press a certain amount of weights, or I can fire a weapon, right? Could you be convinced of that? Or if I told you that I'm a genuinely, special, widely admired paragon of virtue, how readily could I convince you of that? Right? In other words, why are you more ready to believe me about my wealth and perhaps my physical prowess or the evidence thereof, but perhaps less convinced of my moral claims about myself? And it's really quite simple, because being considered morally virtuous reflects a special kind of status. Okay, so what do I mean by status? From a sociological perspective, and from Murray Milner, my PhD advisor who just passed away this past year, He talks about status as, quote, referring to the accumulated balance of approvals and disapprovals that people express toward an individual, group, or object. Okay, end quote. So status can be viewed as basically synonymous with honor or prestige, although there's some nuances to these different concepts. But all else equal, we generally prefer to have more status rather than less, just as we'd probably rather have more wealth or power rather than less. Not all of us, and obviously that's not a universal set of standards. But what I'm focusing on today is mainly at the individual and interpersonal determinants of status and morality. I should note that these issues also can be studied fruitfully at the organizational level or even at the macro social level. Okay, so anyway, that's what I want to say about that. Now, why is status important to our discussion of morality? Well, what I want to suggest is that status is an especially rare and valuable resource in some respects. And again, it depends on the context, but it's more difficult to obtain because it has two distinct qualities that don't characterize economic and political resources. And these are inalienability and inexpansibility. Try saying that 3 times very fast. But status has an inalienable quality as a resource that others confer upon the person or the object in question through their positive and negative evaluations. One can be robbed, for example, at an ATM, right? Your money or your life, but you can't steal someone else's status. Nobody comes up to you and says, your status or your life. Doesn't make any sense, right? So status can't be appropriated arbitrarily or simply claimed on one's behalf. It depends instead upon the evaluations of others. And this is what we mean by this inalienability quality that it has. To change one's status requires that you change the balance of approvals and disapprovals that are bestowed upon you, okay? The relative inalienability of status therefore enhances its desirability. Elites who procure additional wealth or political power nearly always try to convert some of those resources into status resources, which will help give it greater security and legitimacy, okay? But the thing about status, again, the reason it's difficult to obtain, it accumulates over time, just like a tree takes years or perhaps decades to reach its full maturity, right? Status and building one's reputation requires quite often years of work and effort, right? But like that imaginary tree, our status can be destroyed almost instantly with the chainsaw or the chainsaw of gossip or one horrible misstep or a sordid revelation about our behavior. And of course, once destroyed, it can take years to regain that status or regrow that tree, okay? Another feature of status is its relative inexpansibility. So whereas economic and political resources can be increased exponentially, and there are various mechanistic ways that we can do that, such as acquiring wealth through jobs or job changes or investments or land or what have you, or the redistribution of financial and material resources, such as tax policies or family planning initiatives and so on. And in a similar way, you could try to convince people in the community to give you increased public support. You could try to strengthen your alliances with others. You could stockpile weapons to alter the balance of political power, okay? And so economic and political resources can be expanded substantially, both in absolute and relative terms. And at the macro institutional level, total economic and political resources, for example, can be increased rather dramatically, such that some societies have per capita incomes and armament levels hundreds or even thousands of times greater than others. But in contrast, status as a resource, as I mentioned, cannot be manufactured on one's own per se, existing only in a relational context. And within status hierarchies, here's the key point. An individual's relative rise is almost always accompanied by someone else's decline in relative ranking. If that weren't the case, then we'd all have polygamous relationships and be married to tons of people, which we're not. that's one form of that's one type of relationship where somebody ascends to the pinnacle of the status hierarchy, right? Our soulmate, our love, the love of our lives, right? Not everyone occupies that particular position, right? Okay, and not everyone's viewed as equally popular or attractive or cool, all right? There are finite opportunities to be the pageant winner, to be voted most popular, to be one of People Magazine's sexiest people of the year, or on Time Magazine's cover for Person of the Year, and so on, right? The selective bestowal of these evaluations helps ensure that a process of status inflation doesn't set in, right? And devalue the relative worth of these accomplishments. And that's why many people can name the gold medal winner, for example, from the 100-meter dash from the previous Olympics, right? Or like I would bet most of you know who the men's 100-meter record winner was from the last couple of Olympics. Actually, the last three, I believe, or so. Usain Bolt. Does that sound familiar? Anybody heard of Bolt? Of course. Okay, but if I ask you who won last year's Special Olympics 100-meter dash, do you know? Of course not. You weren't following that. Furthermore, everybody gets a ribbon or a medal. So in that sense, the wealth of status, right, of accomplishment is distributed broadly across the population. And that's indeed the point of the Special Olympics. But it also means that you don't stand out quite as much either in that particular context as you would if you won the gold medal in the Olympics, right? So the precarious nature of status means that efforts to secure this resource can often lead to pretty intense efforts to defend our reputations, right? The loss of status, as I mentioned, is difficult to replace. And this gets us back to something that I think we learned probably, most of us should have learned probably back in high school, in terms of how we're influenced by the distribution of three basic fundamental types of resources and forms of power: economic, political, and social power, right? So these are different types of sanctions that can be applied as well in terms of goods and services, in terms of force, and in terms of expressions of approval and disapproval. And these then again correspond to three fundamental types of economic, political, and social power, or status power. So the CEO of a multinational corporation, the US president, and the Dalai Lama all specialize in a certain type of power. And of course, these people each possess varying types of other resources too, right? These are not completely unique in and of themselves, but analytically, they do tend to vary independently of one another, okay? And typically, people strive to influence and control their environments by using the different types of power and resources that are most readily available to them. So most important today, I want to argue that human beings are most readily distinguished, not simply because of our syntactical language, but because we are evaluative creatures. We routinely use various symbolic forms to render judgments about the desirability of other people and their relationships. Some people are admired far more intensely, are held in higher regard, and possess more status than others, right? So for example, why has Honest Abe been lionized in the history textbooks? Such that the African-American painter Horace Pippin once ranked him, that is Honest Abe, along with Jesus Christ and John Brown, as one of the three great men, quote unquote, in history. Whom do you consider to be the most virtuous individuals on the planet today? And are you among them? Right? How do we know? Sociologically speaking, here's how we know. Okay? Well, extra. There are three main mechanisms for acquiring status. First, those who adhere to the dominant norms acquire status primarily in conjunction with the reference group in question, right? Since standards vary across societies or across social context. The worker who arrives on time and regularly produces at a high level is going to be considered dependable and an effective employee, right? If you abide by all the rules, all else equal, you're going to acquire at least a modicum of respect and social status, especially in those contexts where the rules are widely considered to be legitimate, such as showing up for work on time and not making excuses. A second means of acquiring status involves achieving new standards of excellence, which in some respects is an extension of the first, or what I like to call hyperconformity. So if you exceed expectations to establish new conditions of normative excellence, for example, breaking records, so that sort of thing, then you acquire even more status, more public recognition. For example, in sports, as being a superstar, or maybe you're familiar with the term GOAT, G-O-A-T, greatest of all time, right? Again, sort of the ultimate status. Dick Bavetta refereed 2,635 NBA basketball games over 39 years and apparently never missed an assignment. Cal Ripken eerily played 2,632 consecutive Major League Baseball games. Remember that if you're on Jeopardy. These individuals would be placed on the Mount Rushmore of dependable employees, right? Who has greater respect in their fields than the Dick Bavettas and the Cal Ripkens? And finally, the other key source of status is social associations, the fundamental logic suggesting that the more time that's spent in the company of others who have status, this sort of rubs off. You're able to increase your status accordingly. Whereas conversely, if you're associating with low status individuals, then that's going to tend to have the opposite effect. And different bodies of literature have shown consistently that where status assumes primacy in terms of social relationships, then those of higher status tend to distance themselves and restrict access to the lower status. In the extreme, of course, we're talking about slave systems and caste systems, right? And indeed, furthermore, as Milner notes, the high status person who is accessible tends to have his or her status eroded. And so we construct barriers to limit access, such as receptionists and administrative assistants, walled off venues and gated communities, and so on. So, and yet social associations are most relevant only if they're known and seen, publicly acknowledged, right? So that's why it's important. And we, in every context, from which celebrities hang out with whom, with other celebrities, to social seating arrangements in high school cafeterias. To increase one's status, however, generally requires that the social associations occur without coercion and without a financial transaction. The notion of paying someone for their company or to say good things about you tends to devalue or cheapen the status of both persons involved, quite frankly. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, why is this important? Well, because then we talk about social relational context. Beyond the central focus on status, the second key argument is that morality can only be understood within pertinent historical and cultural context in which normative expectations are situated. So the normative foundations of morality can and do vary over time and place. Anthropologists and sociologists and historians have studied why that's the case, and there have emerged a number of interesting arguments that lie beyond the scope of today's presentation. I'll just mention briefly one example. If you were to study infanticide, right, which clearly lies beyond the pale of what's considered morally acceptable in contemporary societies. Yet the practice has been far more widespread historically, explained as a form of population control or as a means of enhancing reproductive success. And there are still many contexts where the practice is actually viewed as justifiable, such as, for example, among the Aymara in the Andes, who offer both biological rationales, the infanticides occur where there are deformities, for example, and social rationales, that is, that children born out of wedlock or born into poverty, that these contexts justify infanticide. Also, I'm sure many of you are aware that more generally, female infants have long been at greater risk for infanticide than their male counterparts, such as among the Inuit or those indigenous groups living in the far north or in India, and in a number of other places where the anthropological evidence has highlighted females' economic marginality or costs, quote unquote, in socio-historical context. And we've long documented that female fetuses have a higher probability of being aborted across many cultures as well. So if you want to engage in an especially heated ongoing debate about morality in the current US and other places, I'm sure, you can hardly find a more divisive issue than abortion. And so we can logically then ask, well, why is that the case? Why should abortion emerge as such a hot button issue? Well, I can't say today because I have to get on to other things. But I want to suggest, though, that even in the case of abortion, especially in the case of abortion, social locations clearly matter and evaluative stances will vary accordingly. Or consider the more pedestrian, dare I say, issue of having an affair or cheating on one's partner. So hands up, how many have cheated on your partners? Oh, sorry. That's not something that people want to respond to publicly. Why is that? Because it devalues your status, right, as an honest, caring individual. So again, these are not the sorts of things that we ask or profess publicly. And they're status concerns. That's precisely why. Okay. So I mean, I'm trying to be funny, obviously, but you be the judge of that. But Van Hoof has demonstrated recently that infidelity remains one of the nearly universally condemned relationship practices, at least within the United States. And yet it's a normative standard that's often violated by men and women alike, with untold millions of people having reported affairs at some point or another in their relationships. Now, of course, there are other sociocultural contexts where attitudes towards extramarital affairs are a lot more lax. But that's generally not the case, for example, if you focus just regionally on North America, or especially if you look at Canada, the United States, and Mexico as the three largest countries in North America. Okay, you're not supposed to have affairs, and that's almost universally agreed upon across these countries. But on the other hand, well, let me just suggest, so while lifelong partnerships and being faithful may not quite be as revered as in days of yore, if I were to tell you that I've been married to the same person for over 30 years and I've never strayed, and indeed that I've never even thought about having an affair, how would I be evaluated on that measure? How would you evaluate me? You'd say, wow, Michalski, you're pretty awesome. I mean, set aside everything else I might have done in my life, or any other, stupid things I might have done, but just on that one metric, I'd be ranked pretty highly, wouldn't I? Well, truth is I've actually been married for 30 years, but one time for 17 years and now currently for 13 years. So that's my 30 years. So do I still have as much status? A friend of mine recently posted on Facebook that they just celebrated 25 years, and we all said, great, lovely couple, great for you, but I did offer one little post. I said, if it's a competition, I'm at 30 years. Yeah, 17 from the first and 13, but that's 30. So I'm ahead, right? So, never mind. Anyway, but I'd be fairly high up in the status system if I were able to demonstrate my loyalty, my faithfulness, right? Okay, well, let me make, what's going on here? Let me make two quick points then. One, the social context, again, always matter, both temporally. What's the current zeitgeist about relationships and monogamy, for example? And in terms of the prevailing cultural standards. In other words, what's the normative content with respect to any specific issues, such as infidelity? And then the second point is the most crucial one. What are the existing socio-spatial configurations of those immersed in their social lives, right? Who's involved in your social world? What's the nature of the relationship? Where are we positioned, and so on? And I argue that these are the keys to determining one's moral status, okay? So the degree to which you're evaluated positively or negatively is directly affected by your relative location in social space. And you'll recall that from my anecdote about perfect driving records of my father versus my own flawed driving record, right? More generally, there are some categories that are more relationally privileged. Others suffer what I call relational deficits in terms of status, okay? Those people who are in relative positions that bias against their acquiring status, no matter what they do, okay? They are positioned, if you will, at the wrong angles of social space. So by social space, then, what I mean is ontologically, this multidimensional social universe that's created through interpersonal interactions. So every time two or more people interact through some medium or another, a matrix of mutual social influence emerges. And that resultant social space can be defined by the relationship dimensions involved, okay? How do we conceptualize that? Well, at the individual or interpersonal level, we have a natural disciplinary convergence, I think, between sociology and psychology. So we can talk about this intersubjective matrix of psychological distances that include physical and social space that we have to span to communicate and to engage one another in whatever activities, okay? Unlike physical space, though, social space is responsive to the functional influences reflecting human needs and motives and resources. So again, I think this is where sociology and psychology naturally overlap. Sociologically, we view individuals as evaluative beings, as I've mentioned, who use social information to assess everyone's background characteristics and status positions relative to each other, as well as across the various social contexts within which we encounter each other. So we always have a relative position, and just like physical space, we can't occupy exactly the same social relational space as anyone else at the same time. We can move, and we are constantly moving and fluctuating. Already today, even though we're not too intimate, we're more intimate than we were 30 minutes ago. You know me a little bit better, most of you, than you did 30 minutes ago. We have a little bit more of a relationship, right? So it's always changing and evolving, and it's complex and nuanced. And by the way, you might actually hate me now from what you've heard, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on there. Okay. And the point, of course, is that when we study the relative positions and our angles to each other, then we're able to evaluate who has greater or lesser moral status accordingly, okay? And this is due to the fundamental, what I call the fundamental social forces of social space. So my own view, at least for now, is that there's some basic social forces that influence how people interact and relate to one another. And each of these are, you can think of them each of as a force vector that reflects different combinations of multiple subdimensions. So vertical space would be defined by issues of inequality and the inequalities surrounding different kinds of resources. Again, whether you're talking about wealth or political, economic resources, which is obviously a key domain. We could also be talking about the degree to which people exercise power over one another, as I mentioned previously. And we could talk about the resources of social status and respect and prestige, okay? So to what extent do people receive praise or accolades from others rather than censure or criticism? And not everyone, as we know, garners equal respect or equal social recognition. So that's a third key type of resource. And so we see these fundamental resources, as existing in every encounter, okay? Every observable interaction will have varying amounts of economic, political, and status resources and power relative to each other. And these are extraordinarily important in terms of the degree to which they vary, or co-vary, or may operate independently on different axes, depending on the context. The two other dimensions I'll just mention briefly capture our measures of beyond inequality, like the vertical dimension. We can also talk about the morphological dimension or our relational distance and the degree to which people participate in one another's lives and the depth of their involvement with one another. And so if you've been in a relationship longer, if you interact more regularly, if your interactions are more intensive, spending time together at a dinner versus a business meeting, you have a closer or more, what we call a more intimate relationship, right? That's very psychological, but that's what we're talking about. And we can literally map out our relational structures to determine who's located within each other's social networks, identify possible linkages and nodes, and then measure the extent to which people's lives may intersect, and so on. Okay, anyway, that gets into the details. And then we have symbolic space, right, or cultural distances. The degree to which people have similarities or reflect the breadth and the diversity of their symbolic connectedness or their relative lack thereof. So if you share the same language, ethnicity, alma mater, maybe religion with another person, then these would be indicators of cultural similarities. And of course, the subdimensions of culture could be multiplied much more, infinitely. But the logic suggests some kind of a continuum ranging from extreme cultural homogeneity to cultural diversity and heterogeneity. And then what's so complex, and this is why intersectionality reasoning is so important, these multiple distances and statuses operate simultaneously and in different combinations. Okay, so here's the synthesis. Here's the payoff for your patience and your attention. Why are these dimensions important? Because they establish the parameters that define the nature of our interactions as people encounter each other as persons. We use the available information to establish who we are and where we stand in relation to others in that 1990 film, The Sociocultural Matrix, remember with Neo? And then we imagine that we are clustered rather tightly together, not like Calhoun's rats necessarily, but in terms of our resources and our relational involvement and our cultural similarities. And then the different positions or geometric angles of our relationships have a profound impact on our evaluations. So in common speech, we even talk about trying to see things from a different angle, right? Or a different point of view. And why is that hard at times? Well, because we are situated literally at a relative position that's different from others in seeing the social world, the kind of Rashomon effect, if you will. We inhabit different places. And maybe we're being asked to visit a place in sociocultural space that we've never thought about or wanted to go to, right? So it's often easier said or imagined than done. And hence we can offer several sociological hypotheses to describe the probability of being evaluated as morally upstanding, right? Of having greater or lesser moral status. So I'm going to use just briefly, these are all ceteris paribus propositions. So in particular, moral status varies directly with differential control of resources. In addition, moral status varies inversely with relational distance, such that as we reduce relational distance and establish higher levels of intimacy, we accord individuals greater status than those with whom we are more closely connected or involved with in social space. And similarly, moral status varies inversely with cultural distance. So if we reduce cultural distance, especially across many dimensions that we have in common, then we're more likely to view individuals as morally upstanding, all else equal. So in effect, what I'm arguing is that there's an optimal geometric configuration of angles that puts one in the best position for being viewed as morally upstanding. That position, that vantage point would be if you were to secure the highest ranking in terms of the moral status hierarchy based on the degree to which you control resources, but simultaneously, if you occupy positions of relational and cultural similarity, relational intimacy, I should say, and cultural similarity, okay? Obviously, there's a great deal of complexity and nuance involved, and we have to look at these configurations to capture some of those nuances. But the basic propositions, I believe, hold out quite well. So in other words, as I mentioned in my presentation today, if I've established a slightly greater degree of intimacy with my audience, much like we do when we're teaching, and if I've repositioned myself to better angles and hit the right notes, then you'll view me as a slightly more respectable person or speaker or academic, all right? Of course, I can immediately shoot myself in the foot and undermine my moral status with an ill-timed faux pas, such as a revelation of the utter stupidity of my claims, or by not speaking a language that you understand, or by showing up disheveled and smelly in your appearance, right? So I did shower and everything today and shaved. So all, of course, which is part of, as Scott noted long ago, is it refers to the presentation of the self, right? And we try to optimize that if we're hoping to increase our status, all right? And people know this almost universally. Just briefly, I've coached basketball for decades, and one time a few years ago, I was driving back and I had four teens, 14, 15, 6-year-olds in my car who I was driving home after practice late at night. And they all happened to be Black kids, right? African Canadian kids. And unfortunately, I had to get the one kid home by 10:30. His mother demanded it. And I ran a stop sign and the police pulled us over. And without a hint of irony or, just immediately, one of the kids in the back said, "All right, everybody, act white." So he immediately, of course, it was funny, we all laughed, but he was immediately sharing a core sociological wisdom, which is, you know what, if you want to have a positive evaluation in this encounter, you better reduce the cultural distance, raise the status, and do whatever, employ whatever mechanisms you can to ensure a more favorable evaluation. And that's the core of what I've been arguing today. Where I want to end today, though, is taking it just one step further. And this is the part that I never shared previously. And that is, why do these social forces matter? What are the underlying mechanisms that explain this? So I'm going to be as brief and as quick as I can, because I know I'm just about out of time. But first, let's just look at, let's reverse the order and just look at the cultural dimension, just briefly, and in a little bit more depth. And the other two I'll skirt over very briefly. But consider the social psychological research that demonstrates overwhelmingly the ubiquity of our implicit biases that favor the familiar. This is what Jennifer Eberhardt has convincingly demonstrated in her recent book, Biased, which, by the way, I've assigned to my courses and the students love it. But most obviously, if we learn certain languages first and accents, if we absorb that much more deeply and we establish preferences for what we hear and how we communicate, then this becomes our comfort zone. But we also get accustomed to certain faces and shapes and music and ideas and so on. And this all colors our experiences with the other, whoever those others are out there. And the more time we spend with people or ideas or music, the more familiar, the more comfortable, the more second nature, the more beautiful, and even the more moral these things become in our lives. So for example, the reason that there's always a generational gap in evaluating music, and again, I'm an old person, I'm almost dead, so I don't really count. But the point is that there's always this gap across every generation in terms of, what are these kids listening to these days, right? Well, they're listening to music, but of course it's just different kinds of music. And that's a reflection of literally what we've grown up with, what we've heard, what we've internalized, what has been, neurologically imprinted on our being, not to mention our familiarity with the words and so on and so forth, or our associations with who we were dating or who our friends were, or what we were doing at those times. So every generation will have its preferred music and view it as awesome and amazing and not understand entirely what other people are doing and so on. So we're well aware then that our ability then to develop our evaluative frameworks depends upon our linguistic and our cultural locations. Okay, and that's essentially what I'm saying. And we all have these implicit biases that frame our evaluative stances. So hold constant the behavior, and we will favor those who are more intimate, as well as those with whom we hold more in common. And that's why we also don't allow family members or ourselves on juries, because who are we more intimate with than ourselves, right? We know we're going to be biased in that sense, right? And, think about it, right? If you were, out doing, just giving parking tickets, you think, oh, I'll just be neutral on it and it doesn't matter. I'll just be totally treat everybody equally. But then you come upon your elderly mother's vehicle. Are you going to give her a ticket? Probably not. What if you come upon your own vehicle? The meter expired? Probably not, right? And again, this is why we don't, again, allow ourselves to be on the jury. And that's why people are so outraged that, for example, the president of the United States has claimed that he can pardon himself. it's because it's a violation of a core social psychological principle. So I'm arguing that everybody's biased in creating categories, using social information, and judging others accordingly. And this becomes even more powerful when we assign specific information or traits to people on the basis of those categories, right? In other words, stereotypes. And so we create the conditions when we literally prejudge the morality of others, rooted in these differential forms of categorization. And in the extreme, we designate whole classes of people as untouchables or subhuman. Okay? And these are the worst case scenarios: to be chronically dirty or defined as impure or immoral because of the social category to which I belong. So I'm chronically deviant because I can never change that status, at least in the eyes of the others who are judging me. And I'll always be defined as inferior, if not subhuman. And the research shows that in the extreme, non-family members and outgroups are perceived as more animal-like and dehumanized accordingly. I'm going to skip the examples. So the dehumanization process represents the critical means through which individuals justify the harshest treatments possible of any outgroup defined as in the wrong or somehow representing an affront to the sensibilities of the group. And so the cultural distance factor has many different dimensions that all of which, or any of which, can activate implicit biases. And I want to propose reduce the energy expenditures to allow us to connect more readily, to hear others more favorably, and evaluate them more positively. So if I hear the exact same facts or witness the exact same behavior from someone with whom I identify, I'm going to rate that individual more favorably and will be more inclined to accord them more moral status. And in contrast, note how much energy you have to expend to connect with somebody who doesn't speak your language or who doesn't share your values. Or if you're trying to completely exclude from your sphere people, this requires an enormous investment of energy. If you want to participate in genocides or if you want to build walls, and so on. Okay. Okay. So let me just wrap up with just a couple of more slides here. Relational distance. Again, I don't have the time to go into this, but there's also an expenditure of energy that's involved here, linked to our sense of order, chaos, and the stability of our networks and our relationships. The point is that the stability of our relationships and our social ties reduces uncertainty, ensures a certain degree of orderliness, and even safety, if you will, in an otherwise somewhat uncertain or unpredictable world. And if we have patterns of regular recurring interactions, that creates stable foundations that facilitate our ability to navigate through the world. So the more ties that we have facilitate the development of intimacy, that facilitate intimacy, or the types of social bonds that create interdependencies and enhance our survival. And one might even say reproductive fitness. And perhaps the most profound impacts of reduced relational distance or establishing high levels of relational intimacy have been confirmed in the longitudinal research on healthy child development. So I tell my students, if you can't do anything else as a parent, if you're not rich and you can't provide, the research shows that if you do these two things, read to your children every day and say, I love you, then this has a profound effect in enhancing healthy child development. Why? Not just for the cognitive development, not just the cognitive, but literally you're bombarding the child with the sensory information, the smells, right? The sound of your voice. And I would argue most importantly, the demonstration to the child that no matter what else is happening in the world, you're so valued and valuable that I'm going to invest my time and energy in spending it with you. So that's an important sort of universal lesson that you can, if you want to teach your students about healthy child development. One profoundly supportive relationship can do the trick, but an ever thicker web of relationships and more stable social ties afford even greater protection and comfort in the face of life's exigencies. So there's a multitude of benefits, but the essential ingredient, in my view, of investment in relationships and intimacy is to increase the moral status of the other, even to the point where, as Viviana Zelizer demonstrates, children become priceless and exalted in our lives. Okay, sorry. The final slide has to do with, the final argument has to do with social hierarchies and who are one's superiors, who controls or dominates the resources, who has specific types of power. I use the example of the principal at my elementary school, who could, whenever I was sent down when I was a small child, I was given corporal punishment with a paddle and whacked repeatedly. The paddle had holes in it so that I could be whacked even harder. And but this was acceptable. Even my parents thought it was a good idea. So this is the 1960s. So, but I wasn't too big a fan of it, right? But within hierarchies, who has the power? Those are the people that have control, and those are often the people who also have the status as well. Okay, and it's hard to fight against that, especially if you're the child, especially if the cultural imprimatur is that that's acceptable, and especially if you don't have the decades of research at the time that demonstrates the negative impacts of corporal punishment, right? And I didn't have a PhD to defend my claims. This is who I was. So now if you ever set foot on my property, well, I'm going to stand my ground. And yes, that's a real picture of me. That's, I'm standing sentry outside my house. And I look disturbed. I've always been disturbed. Anyway, all right. So in conclusion, then, obviously, what I'm arguing is that social superiority enhances moral status. Might doesn't necessarily make right, but it certainly defines right and privilege. And it's a very important location for accruing moral status. You're afforded much greater control over the terms of the discussion in terms of both defining and enforcing morality. And of course, this only occurs if you're able to establish legitimacy. And we do that typically through rituals and narratives and other mechanisms. But those atop the social hierarchies everywhere enjoy greater moral status than anybody else, all else constant. So what I'm arguing today then, and I thank you for your patience as I whip through this, is that the sociological principles involved here encompass everything from what I've defined or referred to as the sacred notions of dirt and pollution. And of course, that varies across cultural contexts. But the main point is that to designate someone as being morally steadfast or as someone with integrity, This is always contingent upon the social context and the nature of the relationships involved. Okay. And the psychologist, again, can explain better than I why people might desire this specifically. But we're these evaluative creatures, these evaluative animals, and whether we're moral or immoral depends upon our structural locations in the social universe, vis-a-vis everybody else in our social networks and with whom we're interacting and who's observing, as well as our varying capacities to understand the normative expectations, demonstrate conformity, and establish our key associations with others. All of this will influence the degree to which we're defined or considered moral or immoral. You want to go before the court, make sure you bring high status, nominally objective observers who can vouch for your reputation. Yeah, it's not having to do with the facts of the case. You're trying to socially influence and sway the outcome. You want to be held morally upstanding. And this is the key argument. If we'd like to be thought of as angels, then we better be socially positioned at the right angles. All right, that's my argument. Feel free to disagree or refute. Social locations then set in motion the sociocultural forces that establish the context for evaluating information, even so-called factual information, in vastly different ways that align with our justification systems for why we tend to view ourselves and our kind as moral and righteous, while perhaps less convinced of the moral value of others outside of our group or not like us. In addition, and if the conditions are right, then we really dig in with our positions and can't be dissuaded from our justifications, no matter what the evidence. This is what I call confirmation bias on steroids. In other words, that's why we often hear statements from mothers of accused killers along the lines of, well, that's my son and I raised him. And no one knows my son like I do. And he could never hurt anyone. He isn't capable. He's a good boy. Interestingly, you're far less likely to hear that from the fathers. But again, that reflects social distances in the relationships, I would argue. Again, I think it's a really fruitful area for sociology and psychology to be working together and digging into these mechanisms further that I've been talking about in terms of investments in energy investments, in terms of social stability, in terms of enhancing our survival. All of this is the stuff that I think animates these structural relations. So again, I can't go into further on that today, but I will sum up with one final statement. So who's most likely to be at risk for being evaluated as morally suspect or dehumanized? Those who are less integrated and less intimate with their accusers, or especially where social and legal barriers reduce opportunities for integration. Those who are more culturally distant along multiple dimensions and less able or willing to conform to the dominant group norms. Those who are in a chronic state of disrepute, defined as immigrants or illegals or aliens or refugees, these types of folks, where they suffer some type of collective liability independent of themselves and their own behavior. They're already adjudged in a harsh way. If you're lacking allies in your social networks of support, or you don't have the network supporters or partisan supporters, and if you lack the resources and to counter the dehumanization and demonization narratives effectively. So to the extent that these conditions all intersect, to differentiate more comprehensively groups or individuals and groups from each other, then there's a greater likelihood of more severe punishment and of being adjudged to be morally deficient. Or in the worst case scenario, if you're dehumanized, you have no moral standing at all. All right, thank you. So that's my talk, and appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Joe,
Right.
for that excellent talk. It gave us a lot of things to think about and talk about. I'm excited for our discussion coming up. And you really set the stage really nicely with that. So two things are going to happen today. Now, first of all, let me also thank those of you in the group for your patience in hearing this out, and your patience, I guess your enforced patience with the muting. You can tell me how you feel about that later or during this session if you'd like. So two things are going to happen now. One is I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves, and then I'm going to assign you to breakout rooms. Whoops. That's what I wanted. Oh, okay. It's already done. And then the second thing is that or the third thing really in the breakout rooms is I've asked a few people to moderate the breakout rooms. And so in Joe's terms, I'm trying to confer a little status on them if I can. So Will Fleeson, uh, Kat Darnell, and Taya Cohen have agreed to moderate the sessions. They may have more or less to do depending on how things go, but if there needs to be a little bit of organizing, they can do it. And then we're going to decide in each group who's going to report back to the whole group what the gist of the discussion was in the breakout rooms. And then we'll have some time to just talk together as a whole in addition to that. So that's what's happening now. I'm going to assign you to the groups now. And here we go. And we're going to be 20 minutes in the groups, and then we'll come back as a whole. Okay, I think we've whittled ourselves down to the very committed. I appreciate your willingness to stay. I know we said we'd finish at 1. We're going a little bit over to accommodate some larger group discussion. And I appreciate your willingness to do that. If you need to leave, feel free to depart whenever that's makes sense for you. But again, I want to thank Joe for his wonderful talk and the food for thought that he's provided for us. I, all of you know, I skipped around to the breakout room to try to get a little sampling. And I mentioned that I was exercising my privilege. Truth is, any of you could have done that, but I didn't tell you. I don't know. I think everyone who is still with us is part of the network. I was going to make a pitch for people if they, or not a pitch, but an invitation for people to join if they'd like. If you happen to know anybody who was in this group or otherwise would like to be a part of the network, that's just been very informal. People send me an email, I add them to the listserv, and then you're sort of informally part of the network. The other thing that's coming up is we're working diligently on a website that you will be hearing about as time goes on, and have an opportunity to have your own personal page on the website. And it'll be a way to keep in touch and find out what each other's doing and communicate. So I think that's pretty exciting. So I'm hoping to have an announcement about that within the month. But it's actually already up and running. It's called moralityresearch.org. So if you want to just go see what's there already and get an idea what's happening, you can do that anytime. It's pretty limited right now. I think I'm the only member page, so it's a little boring. But let me open it up for discussion. And if the people from the breakout rooms want to summarize, we'll start with breakout room 1, which I think was Will Fleeson, then go to 2, Kat Darnell, 3, Taya Cohen. Just give us a 2-minute summary of what you heard in the breakout room, or if you assigned someone else to do that or invited someone else to do that.
Lucas generously volunteered to do our summary.
So we had a long and interesting discussion. And I think it all centered around the relationship of moral status to status in general. The sort of beginning thrust was our status itself and moral status, could they be different things? And if they are different things, we started exploring, okay, what are the basis by which we evaluate someone's moral status as opposed to status itself, status in general? Jose offered a mimetic analysis saying that one's moral status is particular to the group one's in. So he kind of pushed against this idea of an aggregate one value, saying, no, it's actually specific to groups. And then we sort of came across the Humean question of if there are independent moral facts, well, first of all, it was moral anti-realism or realism. So can there be moral facts independent of what a group believes is to be moral? And secondly, if there are moral facts, are they accessible? We all sort of concluded there might be, but they're very difficult to access. And that's about where we got to.
Thank you, Lucas. How about group 2?
Yeah, so I just did the notes. I'm very grateful my son is not around still, so I was able, I can unmute myself without a child in the background. So we kind of started off by really thinking about what agency do we have to change within these powers, within this power status, for shifting our location of the angles that we're in. So do we have agency to change these? Who does change these? Brad suggested, kind of followed on from this and talked about how do they get changed and how do agents get critical distance from these. So as an agent, how can you separate yourself from these? And alongside that, Habermas was brought in, and this idea of public spheres and how we might change this kind of power distribution. This then kind of led on to this idea about talking about rationality and how as humans, we're actually not very rational beings and we're not that logical. And actually, perhaps we need to consider this idea of emotions, and Mike talked about this. Blaine then stepped in, and Blaine kind of brought in the idea that actually rationality and emotions can't necessarily be separated. So actually, maybe we should consider them together and not as kind of two separate things. And then from that, we kind of ended kind of on a mixture of idea about thinking about the fact that culture really does matter when we think about morality, but whether culture is the only thing that matters. So is it just kind of like your social environment that is determining what is more moral or not? And in that sense, are there more moral cultures? As you know, is there a very moral culture versus a non-moral culture? And Monica talked about this, used the example that Joe gave in his talk about infanticide. So these perhaps individuals who might decide to end babies' lives versus ones who perhaps try to continue them. Does that make this society more moral versus the other one? And then we went on to talk about actually within each society, everybody will think a lot very hard about these kind of moral rights and wrongs, but it might just be the culture that impacts on how those are interpreted. Yeah, and then that got to the end of our discussion.
Thank you. How about group 3?
Sure, I can talk and others can feel free to jump in. Our discussion, we started talking a little bit about sort of fundamental assumptions in different disciplines, and in particular sociology versus psychology, and the idea of morality being more versus less socially constructed. And so that was sort of some of our conversation related to that. And we also then talked a little bit about how this work can inform what we would take with it, and how can it inform other areas and sort of in the world more generally. And our discussion was centered on how in psychology and economics in particular, there's a lot of focus on sort of moral judgments absent a context. So faceless, nameless, genderless, raceless strangers, and how sociology, and then this work in particular, can really speak to that work about, how the social context, social space, people's relationships, status, all of these things are critical to understanding judgments of morality, and you can't just remove the context in the way that is sometimes done in psychology and economics. Others from group 3 want to weigh in with the other thoughts? That was sort of the main point, so we touched.
Joe, do you want to give a couple of reactions?
Mainly, I want to just express my thanks, because I know I was trying to cover far too much ground and be too grandiose. But what I really like, and what I'm hearing from this group, both these summaries and our own individual group, I'd love to carry on and learn more about others' work and others' perspectives to help flesh out the arguments and to change them where they need to be changed, shall we say. And what I mean by that is I was hinting at the end about some of the social psychological and the convergence. And as Taya was saying, to me, you have to put all of the economics and the psychology in context. But by the same token, what I need and want to do more in my own work is bring more of the psychology and the economics to the forefront as well, and integrate. You see what I'm saying? So I'm interested in carrying on a dialogue even after this, to learn from others and to figure out, whether or not there are other key arguments about how the human being and the human person responds to these dynamics and the different angles. I'm coming at it from the angles perspective, but what I think needs to be fleshed out further and beyond what I was able to say and what I've been hearing from others are what are some of these excuse me, psychodynamic and interpretive processes that we need to factor in to understand the more dynamic interplay of why we do end up judging things to be moral or immoral, or shifting our behaviors and so on. I do think that'll have a lot of practical impact too, if we can understand better the mechanisms by which we have these, not just our biases, but how we express these and how it plays out in real time. So that's my thought.
Okay. Well, let's open it up to the general group as well for a few minutes at least. Again, I know we're a little bit over, so you can tell me when you can vote with your feet, or you can tell me when we need to stop. I'm into it, and I'll stick with you. So are there other thoughts or questions people want to raise with the whole group? Go ahead, Lucas, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sort of a question for you, Joe. Thank you for your wonderful talk. My question was about your personal position about if there are, so the question is, can there be moral facts? And can these moral facts be independent of what the majority of a group believes to be right or wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it sort of came up a little bit in our talk as well, or subgroup. Um, yeah, so from my personal beliefs, this is where I become the uninteresting interviewee because I'm so wishy-washy. I don't know personally, strongly. I do feel that more, what is funny, I was thinking about this actually in the shower this morning. I do think that, I wasn't singing, I was thinking. I was thinking that um, we the reason that we have morale, like nobody talks about, well, not nobody, but rarely does morality come up when we talk about, atoms or interacting or plants, behaving, or even that often, sometimes within other species. But morality really does seem to be this, almost unique, if you will, to the human condition in the sense that we're the only ones. I often make this analogy, this comparison. The lion doesn't say to the rest of the tribe, hey, anybody a vegan here? They just go out and kill, and grab the meat and, the zebra, whatever it is, and that's that. So there's no discussion of the morality. We, on the other hand, have to explain ourselves and justify our human behaviors and our interactions. So but really what I think you're getting at is that age-old question, from the anthropologist and people who, who've been looking at this stuff forever, which is, are these sort of cultural universe or moral universals that transcend time and space? I don't know the answer. I'm leaning more in the direction that maybe there are. And I say this because this is way beyond my expertise. But I say that I think there may be, in the sense that if we can come up with agreed understandings and definitions of human flourishing, and even, if you will, almost like an evolutionary argument about the conditions that promote, human flourishing, and what would that look like? Because what I do know, here's the final comment there. What I do know is that when I've looked at, because I've read a lot of anthropological and historical literature, right? So I'm always trying to figure out, well, what's different about this culture, this country, or this history, right? There do seem to be some common notions around human well-being and flourishing. They are played out differently in different environmental and ecological contexts, but it's sort of the same principle with a lot of core understandings of religion. A lot of the centralizing motifs and themes are quite common, but they're expressed in different language. They're played out in different ways. So my short answer is yes, I think there are, but I think a lot of other smarter people than I am maybe can tell us what that looks like or what it might look like.
You had your hand up, Mike?
Yes, thank you. I have to admit that I think that the concept of a moral fact is not a helpful one. I think it confuses two language games, the moral and the fact, and you immediately run up against the naturalistic fallacy. How do you get from an is to an ought and back again? I think that in my view, the problem that we have when we think about universalism versus relativism, anything goes versus universality, is that we're trying to put morality, in my opinion, in either individuals or in cultures. I think it belongs in neither. I think that morality probably belongs in relations, in the relation between you and me, in the moment, in the context, and that any of these problems that we have, infanticide, abortion, whatever they are, they have a history, and that they have a history in social relations where people create moral codes based on a myriad of contextualized processes, and that if we want to assess their morality, we need to gauge a conversation with those people, and that novel morals will evolve. I don't think that morality is either in the world or in individuals or in cultures. It's between us, and my hope is that something like that could get us together as a species.
Just briefly commenting on that, I think that's a really interesting perspective. And there was a 2011 a paper I really liked by Alan Page Fisk and Tej Rai that is called Moral Psychology as Relationship Regulation. And I think it sort of hits that exact point. And they sort of talk about 4 different prototypes or categories of relationships, and what are the moral norms within each of these kinds of categories, these types of relationships. And I think it speaks to relationships more as the intersection between the more broader cultural psychology view versus more individualistic psychology view. So I think that's also an interesting perspective to bridge some of these different literatures and different ideas.
Go ahead, Cindy.
And I was thinking that I study courage, and I particularly lately have been interested in accolade courage, which I think is now I have many better terms to talk about it as moral status. But we've found that there are some types of courageous actions. There's some kinds of things that people do that like everybody thinks is courageous, and those are things that we tend to put up statues for. And then there are other sorts of things that are very personal and individualized that, like you don't deserve a statue for it because it's based on your individual weakness. But then there's other things that it depends on if you agree with them or not. So a few years ago, did Caitlyn Jenner deserve to get an award for courage? Well, it depends on how you feel about LGBTQ rights. And did the woman who was her polar opposite, who was denying same-sex couples marriage licenses, did she deserve an award for courage? It depends. It's like the opposite people think that she deserved an award for courage. And so, and that's in those contexts, but I think it gets at this sort of universal versus sort of more contextualized within a specific relationship. And then the question is how fine-grained does that go? Does that just go down to the individual relationship? Are there, or maybe another way to put it, to build on what Mike said, is that there's commonalities amongst all of our relationships, and then there's more specific just within the context of this one particular relationship. But
Yeah.
It's really interesting stuff. Thank you, Joe.
I would like to comment on what Joe said about, the universality. There's an argument of separating the genetic from the mimetic, and so information from genes, and that there are maybe, because of a genetic code, there are some behaviors that are universal and that drive down to our genetic code, while there are others that depend on the memes. And so whether you're a Catholic or whatever, or the organism, the mimetic organism to which you refer has its rules, and it's courageous or not, as Cindy was saying, within the context of that set of beliefs. So I think it's useful to separate the two and to look, and also to separate all the different organisms. And you were saying before, is the social status is the accumulation of what other people see of my status as a Catholic, as a husband, as a blah, 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 all of these things.
If I may, excellent point. Thanks, Jose. And I think, let me throw this one final idea just from my perspective out there and see what you think, and see if this resonates across these different lines of argumentation. I'm not the most well-traveled person, but I have traveled to many different countries, and I do speak, some different languages. And everywhere I've gone, and I'm talking about, rural places in South America, big cities in Europe, whatever. Every time I visited somebody in their home, and every time I've had a conversation with somebody, when they invite visitors or guests into their home, what's universal about that experience? And again, if I'm wrong, and if it's not universal, correct me. But have you not all encountered essentially the same thing? What does every household do when you're the guest who comes into their home? What's the one thing that's kind of, apart of greetings, but what's the one thing that every culture does?
Feed you.
Feed you.
Mm-hmm.
Not only do they feed you, they'll usually feed you their best food, whatever that is. And I have to laugh about this because when I was in Ica, Peru, with a native Peruano, a friend of mine, we were given ceviche, which is an incredibly important food in Peru. I, on the other hand, can't digest raw fish particularly well. So as a guest, what do you have to do? You have to, it's a great honor. Thank you so much. Inside I'm dying. On the outside, I'm thanking my host profusely. But every culture, every people's within those cultures, when you're invited as a guest, you are given food. So that speaks to me to a number of important dynamics, I think. And maybe I'm crazy, but I think it does speak to, the importance of life, of food, nutrition, health, and human flourishing. So I think there's some element there. I mean, I'm by the way, I'm very much a relational sociologist. So this whole stuff about relationships, that's exactly what I'm immersed in these days. But I do want to make a plea for, is there something, and to your point, Jose, about the mimetic and about the expression of culture that does come out in these, I don't know whether it's genetic or mimetic, but that comes out, does that make sense? I don't know if anybody has a reaction to that.
Yeah, I think that I was said before, I think organisms evolve and compete to evolve like religions, and they evolve similar characteristics. I said before, like many animals have legs or evolved eyesight or whatever, because it helps them in the competitive environment. So I think status is that. Status is an emergent property of these organisms that helps them to compete. So by having status within the organism, it gives it a competitive advantage over the other organisms with which it's competing. So I think it's super useful to look at it from that point of view, in the sense that status is particular to the organism that you're analyzing. And when we talk about morality, I think it's just what we sort of add from all of the different organisms that affect us, and we make our own standards and our individual position of what is moral and isn't, just by adding up all our ideas of morality from the different organisms.
To me, is the questions. It's really interesting in light of sort of some of the history and social psychology about starting in the 70s, but really in the early 2000s with. There's a paper called Pan-Cultural Self-Enhancement, which is talking about sort of is self-esteem universal or not, and there's debates about this. And it's sort of a similar kind of thing where at the surface level, you may see differences across culture, but the point, this was Konstantin Sedekidis and colleagues, they made, like, if you look at a deeper level, well, there's some universality about everyone wants to see themselves as good, positive, but how we define ourselves varies across culture. And you can, like, and then it's been talked about by others, like you may see, for example, the Maasai tribe in Africa using, I think it's cow's urine to bathe children. I may have lost audio there. But can you still hear me? No? Okay.
Yep.
But it may be that, obviously that's a cultural difference, but there's a cultural universal of all societies, value keeping their children safe and clean, whatever form. And so there's all these debates, I think, at least within psychology that I'm familiar about, sort of on the surface, you can see these very big differences, but if you look at the core sort of underneath that, what's the function? And maybe this gets into those sort of more evolutionary kinds of arguments, Jose, I think you were alluding to, there's similarities. And, to figure it out, you have to think of, like, at what level, how deep versus surface are you going to look for these universalities versus differences?
And I was thinking the same thing when Joe was talking about the married for 30 years and marital fidelity. And I have a friend who's part of the poly community, and their norms are very different, but it's still the deep underlying is we're preserving our relationships, whatever that means. And, so so for him, he's been faithful to these two people for a long time, and the two people are the three of them are all very accepting of each other, and it's just it's the same and it's very different at the same time. And the cow urine example is the same sort of idea, that deep versus surface similarities.
As I'm sure most of you probably know, Richard Schwader has this lovely phrase: universalism without uniformity. So that the both of them, are going hand in hand. And, it seems to me that, whenever we postulate a universal, it's this very, very abstract thing that doesn't have any content. Marriage is universal. Yet when we look at what people call marriage in the particular, we almost don't recognize what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I'm hearing in the conversation is exactly that if we want to try to identify something like what Lucas called moral facts, or something that may be relatively universal, we're going to have to do it at a fairly high level of abstraction, because the cultural variation is going to be wide always, and the variation over time within a culture is going to be wide. So I think you have to be kind of careful about your levels of abstraction there. And then in that way, I think you can accommodate both by looking at very particularist notions of a specific area of interest within cultures and groups and so on. I'm going to pull rank and just say that this has been glorious. I really have enjoyed this so much. I mean, what a pleasure to bring such a group of smart, interesting, interested people together. Wow. It's more than fulfilled what I hoped for. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We'll continue this. And as I say, I would welcome feedback from you, either back channel to me, or if you'd like to make comments on the listserv. I think having a conversation about our conversation is a good thing too. So feel free to use either route, or just be happy to be here. Whatever you want to do, it's all good. So thank you very much. And I'll hope to see many of you again in a month.